Let me do give you my background, because what I'd like to do, I'd like to say a few words about intelligence. We have, okay, I thought we had a technical glitch. By the way, I have no idea what you all are doing. You could be sitting text messaging, you could be each other. I don't know who you're in touch with or what's going on, so I'm just going to assume that you're interested, and we'll go from there, and when you're not, I usually can read that too. So, let me give you some background of myself, because that gives you an area of questioning when we go to Q&A, because I would like to go into extended Q&A rather than just my nattering at you. I would rather have you natter at me with what your interests are and what you think I can tell you. My background, quickly, at Georgetown University, I did a couple years in the Marine Corps. I was serving in Japan. I was recruited there by CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. I spent some 36 years in CIA. I still hold clearances out there. I still go out there from time to time. My career in CIA was operations, which is called the Clandestine Service, now called the National Clandestine Service, and occasionally referred to as the DO, the Directorate of Operations. We are the guys and women now, more and more, who run operations. We're the ones who go into the field, recruit agents, run agents, and engage in covert action. Covert action refers to operations that are designed to influence events abroad. It may be elections. It may be of a paramilitary nature. For example, as you know, CIA was first in Afghanistan. In fact, the first person lost in Afghanistan was a CIA officer, Mike Spann. So the gamut, we run the gamut in operations, everything from field operations, running agents, recruiting agents, to running covert action. You should be aware that you are trained, I understand, to deal with hacking, both understanding how to, as well as looking for what's being done to you. I am trained, conversely, in breaking in, but in a physical sense. In other words, we would conduct break-ins as well, but we're talking primarily here about physical premises, residents, that sort of thing, all in the name of collecting intelligence, and all obviously against the law. Not here, there. So you should be aware of that. Obviously, as we move, into our era, and why we have a generation of folks like you, is because more and more technology and all that this represents works hand in glove with the physical, if you want to call it the physical side of intelligence collection. I was struck today, I've been struck by a couple of things, but one of them that struck me today, if anybody looked at the Washington Post this morning, the article on the black filter, did you see that? It's something designed, it literally is like a ninja cloak. It's a cloak, they don't have it yet, okay, but they're working with something that is so dark that absorbs so much light. It's a very good article, by the way. You'd enjoy it because it is so dark that even at night you can't see it because it's absorbing the light around it. And of course, this goes back to the days of the ninja in early Japan, people dressed in black so they couldn't be seen for breaking into castles and collecting intelligence or carrying out assassinations or whatever. But this is fascinating stuff, and apparently they're making a lot of progress in developing this business of a cloak of darkness, if you will. But I will tell you why it's particularly interesting to me from my side of operations, and that is, it is one thing to recruit someone in a foreign country, or to look for volunteers, if you will. There are different ways, and we can discuss that at length, but you look at the spectrum, did this person volunteer, or were they recruited? Where do they fall on the spectrum? In the case of agents like that, if we were working against a country, and we did during the Cold War, like the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Romania, those countries we called denied areas. The reason we called them denied areas is because the moment we went into that country, we had no free access. We were under 24-hour surveillance, off and on sometimes. Apartments we were living in were bugged. There was a blanket of security, of their counterintelligence security on us. And so hence denied area. It's very difficult to meet someone in an environment like that and recruit them. Now, in your language, you would call this social engineering. In other words, the idea of meeting someone deliberately, perhaps targeting them to meet them, picking them out, who is it you're trying to meet, and that may even be an operation in itself. So you may go through some sort of what we used to call a daisy chain to meet someone, and then to develop a relationship with them and recruit them. Once you do that, that whole process in a denied area, the local service is observing you doing this. So whoever it is that you've targeted and met, they're all over them. So the only way to work in a situation like that was for us to recruit people in other countries, third countries, perhaps even this country, and then when they went back inside, to run them as agents. We, by the way, don't call ourselves agent. I'm not called a CIA agent. I'm called an intelligence officer, an operations officer, a case officer. Case officer to me always sounds like social work, so I'll go with operations officer. At any rate, that was the nature of that exercise, was recruiting people outside, running them inside. Running them inside is terribly, terribly difficult. And therefore, we have resorted to all sorts of things. You've heard of brush contacts, you've heard of car meetings, the gamut of things you see in the movies. And then more recently, high-tech stuff, the rock that was in Moscow, that the intelligence officers walked by and so forth, obviously dealing with some sort of burst transmission or something of that nature. And so, and both sides do this. I mean, it's the same thing you're engaged in. The technology escalates as you're dealing in this kind of conflict, competition, confrontation. So, just by way of background, that is the nature of the clandestine service. In addition to being in the clandestine service for about 2/3 of my career, I did other things in the agency, more of a public nature. I headed up our litigation group during the spy trials of 1985, the litigation group dealing with the clandestine service. I was with the Inspector General, that is the Inspector General inside CIA, for about 3 years. I also was trying to remember what I was. When I left, I was the Director of Media Relations and spokesman for 3 directors, including Bob Gates, who's now Secretary of Defense and doing a great job. And those were much more public jobs. Somebody asked me once what was the most dangerous job I had in the agency. I said, I think it was the one where I had to cover the U.S. Senate up on the Hill and deal with them in a liaison fashion, but because that was new. I had only worked against other governments. I hadn't worked against my own. So I asked Fred Hitz, who was then the chief, I said, well, what am I supposed to do? I mean, how do I, go up and get information and so forth and so on? And it's interesting because it is like a recruitment process. You can't pay people off. I suppose some people pay them off, but we can. But there is a process of, if you want to call it social engineering, but the idea is to try and make the dialogue between the oversight committees, they're the main ones for us, and the agency, in this case it was CIA, meaningful. In other words, to find out what their real interests are so you can address them when you're going up to testify, so people aren't playing ambush witness. So it's not gotcha. It's not gotcha. They can make it gotcha if they want to, but that's not the most productive way to run a government. So sometimes you see gotcha, but ideally, particularly when we go into closed session on the Hill, the idea is to conduct business, not to play games with one another, not to tie up everybody's time. So that, in a word, is my background. I left in '94. I was in private business for a while. I had started a video production company doing both training films, classified, you would call them, industrials, commercial, and as well as commercial stuff. And then I was recruited to be executive director of the Spy Museum. Just a word on the Spy Museum. The Spy Museum is a privately owned museum started by a fellow named Milton Maltz. And I think he worked for NSA during the Korean War for a couple of years as an enlisted Navy man. But he was so impressed by the role that intelligence and espionage played in national security, he always had this dream of doing something that would help educate people about intelligence. And he has a very interesting background, by the way. He owned radio and TV stations in the 70s, 80s, up to the 90s, sold them, became, in effect, a billionaire. And it's interesting what he's done with his money. He's one of the co-founders of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum. He has started the Spy Museum. He has purchased the Burt Reynolds Dinner Theater in Jupiter, Florida, which went bankrupt, turned it into a nonprofit center for the performing arts, and he has a museum in Cleveland that he's donated to the city. It's a Jewish heritage museum, which has become a center for diversity and tolerance. So he's a very patriotic guy, feels very strongly about these issues. He also has a major philanthropy dealing with mental illness and schizophrenia. But he started this museum. I'm the founding executive director. We've been open since July 2002, so we're now in our 6th year. We have had over 3 million people go through that museum, which is quite extraordinary in this town because it's a museum you pay to go into. As you know, most of the museums, Washington, are free. Unless you pay your income taxes, then it's not entirely free because it's, as you know, supported by government funds, the Smithsonian and so forth. So there are only a handful of museums, really, that are charging. Madame Tussauds has just opened up. That's their 7th one. The museum, which will be down on Pennsylvania Avenue, over 200,000 square feet. It's going to be huge, and it opens up, I think, in May. That'll be an interesting one. Then there's another, Crime and Punishment. John Walsh, America's Most Wanted, is opening up his here. So you are getting I think we sort of set the tone, cut the path for people to bring those kinds of museums to Washington. One thing I'll touch on, if you visit the museum, it's an hour and a half, 2 hours. You fellows will probably go through pretty fast. You would find because of what you do and what you know about technology, would find a lot of the stuff primitive. Obviously, it's not classified. It's stuff used during the Cold War. A lot of stuff used during the Cold War, by the way, is still used because when you get into third world countries, you get into countries where security services have limited budgets, hidden cameras, hidden listening devices. This stuff, it may look primitive, and I know now we can put a camera in our cell phone and we can buy a pen that'll do a scan and so forth. But we developed all that stuff for intelligence purposes. It was very high end. It was very costly when we started it. The idea of a scanning pen, no one had ever heard of that. So those kinds of things. So you'll see some of that there. There's also something there called Operation Spy, which is an experiential thing, about an hour. 15 of you can go through it at once. And that's about an hour. And so it takes you into a real intelligence problem with challenges. And it's a lot of fun. And one of the things you will encounter if you go through there is to make a decision right towards the end of the problem about doing something. I won't give it away. But one of the things is acting unilaterally inside this country. And by unilaterally, I mean don't tell the government. And so there's a question, how people are going to come out. It's interesting to hear the discussions around that. But if you read the Washington Post, I think it was Monday or so, talking about the CIA strike in Pakistan, and which we took out an al-Qaeda leader, one we've been looking for years, and was responsible for many American deaths. But that was a strike. Eventually the button was pushed at Langley, but it was a Predator missile, and we were able to track. It looked like a convoy of people carrying someone very important, and eventually they targeted it, and it was a major, major al-Qaeda leader, so there's now one less. Now, what is interesting about the article is this was done without consultation with the government in Pakistan. So you almost have a Dodge City-like situation in some of these countries. And as we go in pursuit of terrorists, sometimes, as you know, we have in our country the doctrine of hot pursuit. You just go for it, and you don't worry too much about the jurisdictions and the niceties. And you're seeing some of that play out now on the international stage. So, a little bit on the museum. I'll be glad to take any questions on it. Just a word or two about the community, the intelligence community. As you know, the new guy on the block is the DHS, Department of Homeland Security. They took, 180,000 people and scrunched them together and put a title on the door, and there they are, trying to sort themselves out. The fellow in charge of their intelligence analysis side is a wonderful guy from the CIA named George Allen, who for years has been one of our really sterling senior analysts in charge of the President's Daily Brief and that kind of thing. So I think, they are really making the best of, what is a difficult situation. I think to some extent, the jury is still out on the DNI. Now, by DNI, that's the Director of National Intelligence. You remember, if you don't remember, I'll tell you, but for years, the Director of CIA wore 3 hats. One, he was over the community. 2, he ran CIA, and he was the intelligence advisor to the President. It was always a tough job, because those 2 hats, particularly, that is trying to be over the community and run CIA, are very demanding. And the directors always said they never had enough authority to really bear down and make it happen, even though there was a community management staff under him. It's been a him up until now. Well, as a result of the 9/11 Commission, you had the creation of this new position, Director of National Intelligence. And that has, I think, currently about 1,500 people. I think that's my understanding. The concern in the intelligence community, I think by the people there, is, will it simply become another layer? In other words, the idea is it's supposed to actually manage, not necessarily run, say, CIA, but actually manage the community in terms of people, resources, balance, and so forth. It's, relatively new, and as I say, I think to an extent the jury is still out. The CIA, on the other hand, I was there today, and I was talking to the head of the DO, now called the National Clandestine Service. That is still evolving in two. In other words, what role will the National Clandestine Service, are we, if it's them, going to coordinate, say, on all double agent operations, all dangle operations? To what extent will it be involved in counterintelligence? In other words, vis-a-vis the FBI and so forth. It was interesting talking to the head of the clandestine service, a fellow by the name of Mike Sulik. If you remember the story, he was the one who quit under Goss over a personnel issue. And in the end, Goss quit as director, and Mike Sulik is back as the DO. But he was saying, because he's been traveling out to the field, he said, well, it's been very interesting because he said, back here in Washington, we're doing all this stuff, we fight these turf battles, and how many words should be in that, and who do we send this to, and who's going to coordinate on that, and it's the bureaucracy really at its worst, because this is where it comes together. And he said, it's such fun to go to the field, because you have all these young men and women out there, they're FBI, they're CIA, they're everything but the Coast Guard, perhaps, and for all I know, they're out there too. He said they don't care about that, they're just doing the work, and he said it's just so great to be out there and see that's not their worry. They're going to let the guys back there in Washington sort all that stuff out. So that's just one word on the community. What I'd like to do really is, you all come from a variety of different disciplines. You're going in different directions. You have many different interests. I really would like to open it up and see where your interests lie, because I think that's going to be more meaningful. Yeah, Jeff, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so on that point, I've always been a believer in skill over tools. And so I'm wondering, in the clandestine world, how much do you actually ever rely on a tool? Or is it all about, bubble gum and baling wire and, looking them in the eyes versus a high-tech gear and a spy camera and
It's a good, well, I know where you're going with that. In other words, what you see in the movies, when James Bond, Q comes out and has these wonderful tools.
I mean, is it the agent with the best gear or the agent with the best training? I would always think it would be the best training that would win.
It's the most creative, the most imaginative people, the most forward-leaning people that wins. Because, and you should be aware of this too, often in dealing with, here's an interesting thing, because we who are not in the technology world have had to grow used to dealing with technology. So, for example, the support element in CIA was called the Office of Technical Services. That was in the clandestine service. It was moved out and put into another directorate, which is a major arm, the Director of Science and Technology. And the problem was that it belonged back with the operators because they were the ones who drew on it. And the technical people needed to know what was happening in the street and what we needed. So we're running into these horrendous problems, which really were communications problems. In other words, we would say in the clandestine service, we need this kind of widget. And that would make its way through the bureaucracy and land on someone's desk, and they would create it. And then the day would come when there'd be a conference room with a table, and someone would bring this in and put it down on the table and say, there it is. And the operator would look at it and say, that's beautiful, but it's got to go in my pocket. There it's sitting there like this. Or picks it up and shakes it and says, can this be thrown out of a car at 60 miles an hour? And of course the tech looks over horrified, having his baby thrown out of a car at 60 miles an hour. So we had a lot of that. Obviously I'm oversimplifying, but there was a great deal of this kind of miscommunication. We finally learned, it took a long time, to put some techs inside the clandestine service to be spies, and I mean that in a good sense. So they saw how it worked, what the mentality was, what the culture was, and so forth, and take some of the operators and stick them over into the tech side so they would also be spies in the good sense. That was one of the most productive things we did. And so I think the understanding and use of technology is so far advanced now in CIA that it gets you into another problem, and that is, we are all fascinated by gadgets, perhaps you even more than most people, because you live in that kind of world in a way. And there's a tendency, and you see it in Hollywood in the films and in fiction, to sort of put a lot of weight on the gadgets, the gadgetry that do things. Whereas for us, for example, social engineering involves no gadgets. It's all about people. It's all about relationships. It's all about, if it involves gadgets, they may be crude. I remember I was trying to meet a guy once. I wasn't trying to meet a guy. We were trying to engineer I'll say a Soviet, because there aren't any more Soviets, they're Russians now. We wanted to effect a dangle operation. A dangle is when you put someone out in the way of an intelligence officer or an intelligence service and hope that they pick them up. And so what you want that service to think is they have found them on their own. So what I was trying to do was create an operation where the Soviet intelligence officer we had in mind would find this guy on his own. So what we did, and let's call this guy Henry's easier. So what we did, we took Henry's car and we rigged it so that he could literally pull a plug and it would develop severe engine trouble and start smoking. Okay? We knew when the Soviet was going home. We knew when he'd be coming up the road. So, sure enough, on Thursday evening at 5 o'clock, there he is pulling into his driveway, and this guy comes careening down the road, and all of a sudden the car starts smoking and moves over to one side. Soviet runs over to help. For heaven's sakes, this guy works on the air, and then they get to know each other and so forth. Well, it worked. You're baiting a hook. And so that's high tech in social engineering, okay? Making a car break down. So your world is a world that is both a great blessing but also a great challenge for us, because when I functioned overseas in the field, I'll just say in the field, I couldn't, the most fundamental thing you do in your office, the easiest thing you folks do is probably send email or text message. But the easiest thing often for us was a phone call. But because of the nature of the business, because the phones are covered, we can't use the phones. We're denied that. So I'm talking before cell phones. So we're denied that as a means of communication. So the only way of communicating would be to go to an outside phone or phone a blind phone that he or she will get a message from, leave some, chalk marks on a mailbox, whatever it was. We had to develop very crude methodology to communicate with our agents. Again, remember, agents are those foreign folks who we've recruited or have agreed to work with us. So now we have the capability of cell phones, text messages. And let me come back to text messages. the capability of cell phones. On the other hand, they can be listened to also, because all that stuff's out there, isn't it? It can all be grabbed out of the air. So then you get into trying jumbling it and encrypting it. So, you know, it's the technology war. And even if you encrypt it, as you know, you can do analysis. You can, for example, Soviets got very good at this. They got very good at it. I just talked to the Soviet, the Russian, who was the #2 guy in Manhattan in the Residentura, which is the the Russian station, equivalent of a CIA station, for 5 years in Manhattan. And he was there from 95 to 2000. The last 2 or 3 years of that time, he cooperated with, he defected in place. That is, he agreed to become an agent for the FBI and CIA. So for 3 years, the better part of 3 years, he was our penetration, our mole inside the Russian Residentura. He brought out something on the order, I believe, of 40,000 classified documents. In the Residentura, he ran something on the order of 60 officers, like myself, case officers, working New York. In Manhattan, in New York, he had a total of 150 agents. Again, using the word agents to mean Americans, or perhaps they weren't American citizens, but people cooperating. Now, he's written a book. It's out there. It's called Comrade J. And I interviewed him on C-SPAN. You can pull that out too from the pick that up. It was on a program called Afterwards. His name is Sergei Trechikov. Interestingly, in the interview and in the book, Comrade J by Pete Early, he does not go into that period in New York. He talks about the KGB. He talks about his time in Ottawa, where he also ran agents. He gives the names of agents up there, very thinly disguised code names. But he doesn't go into the New York experience. I think maybe he's made a commitment. At the end of the view, I said, I'm waiting for volume 2, okay, which will go into the New York, which will go into what he did against us. But I recommend it. It gives you insight into the vicious nature of the KGB. That is the internal viciousness of it. You think you have a tough boss or colleague or something, whether you read a book like this. And it's really, really an eye-opener. Okay, be right there.
Didn't the Russians have one here in CIA, Robert Hansen?
Say again?
Robert Hansen, the spy that was just caught in 2001, working for the CIA, but actually working for the Russians as well.
Okay. Bob Hansen, Robert Hansen, was a career FBI employee. And he had volunteered, he worked for the Soviets, later the Russians, for almost 20 years. The question comes up, is Trechikov the one that helped us uncover Hansen? The answer, to the best of my knowledge, is no. We got a file out of Soviet archives. Again, this is social engineering. This isn't, this is not hacking. We got a file out of Soviet archives, which was the file that covered Hansen. He called himself Ramon Garcia. They never knew his true name. And we got that file. The FBI examined it, and there was no indication of the identity of who the American agent was. However, in that file, they had kept some of the material used for dead drop sites. He would wrap his stuff in a garbage bag, put it under a bridge in, common areas, little parks and things like that. And on one of the bags was a thumbprint, and they identified Robert Hansen. That file, incidentally, cost $7 million. That's my understanding of that. The CIA spy was Rick Ames. Yeah, he worked for me at one point before he volunteered to work for the Soviets. I wanted to just say a word very quickly and come right back to you. I mentioned text messaging. I was fascinated to hear on NPR this morning what is going on in Kenya, because I don't know if you're following it, but that's been a country torn by violence for the past month. It's really awful. And it's the Kikuyu against the Luau. And the Kikuyu have traditionally been the dominant tribe. And what's going on in the course of this is a lot of killing, and sort of like Bosnia, neighbor killing neighbor and so forth. The Kikuyu are putting out messages that are sort of dehumanizing Luau, and we need to get our country back and so forth and so on. One of the interesting things that I picked up on that, and I think of it as an intelligence officer, how might this be used for intelligence purposes, is, and this is the first time I've heard this, a lot of the material used, propaganda if you will, by one side, and let's say the Kikuyu, to foster hatred of the other is through text messaging. And that's amazing. I don't know if you remember, but when the Ayatollah Khomeini came back to Iran, and there was the capturing our hostages in 1979, when the Ayatollah returned, he had essentially engineered his return through impassioned speeches and inspiring people and so forth inside Iran, but they did it through cassettes. He would give these things and they'd be distributed inside the country, and we had never seen that. So now this is the first time I've seen text messaging used for this kind of a purpose. Okay, you had a question and two right here.
What can you say about Jonathan Pollard? I mean, it seems that, he's still incarcerated and solitary, and what he did seems to be much less than
okay.
other people have done.
Okay. The question is, what can I say about Jonathan Pollard, who turned out to be carrying out espionage for the Israelis? And Pollard was sentenced to life, as I understand it, as I recall. People say, yeah, but this is a country that we have friendly relations with and so forth. The problem is that even with a country we have friendly relations with, the nature of the material that he gave was so detrimental. And you have to remember, when that goes to another country, you have no idea whether there are other penetrations in that country, whether that country may be used it for bartering purpose with another service. So at the time of his trial, the weight of evidence was, the weight of just the material, and it remained classified, was so great that's why he received that sentence. Now, I know it's been a political football. At one point, it looked like Clinton might grant a pardon, and that was when George Tenet, then the head of CIA, said, if you pardon him, I'll resign. So it undoubtedly will come up again. Certainly is not going to be pardoned during the Bush administration, and then might be an open book. There were two hands here.
Has it been noticed, or have you noticed? I mean, out of the news recently on TV, most news on the internet. Have you noticed that they used coordinated attacks through text messaging also?
Coordinated attacks?
With text messaging.
With text messaging? I haven't, I'm really hearing this for the first time. Yes, it sounded like some of the text messaging was just individuals, but others sounds like it was text messaging, and you all want to understand this better than I do, done systematically. There was a pattern, and so the government, I don't know what extent the government can control this, started putting out its own text messages with messages of peace and harmony and so forth. Now, I understand there was some sense that the government might be able to shut down the text messaging capability in the country. So, and that was obviously an option. There was another hand, yeah.
Kind of along the text messaging line, have there been other civilian technologies over your career where you've been like, hey, wait, this is like a great tool for us, and then vice versa, have there been technologies that have come out on the civilian side where you're like, damn, there goes one of our betting tricks?
Have there been things, I'm not following.
Like have technologies come out for the general populace, like text messaging, where you said, oh, well, I realized.
Yeah, I think it's such a symbiotic relationship. There's coming, and you're all familiar with DARPA, where so much forward-looking stuff comes out of. The whole business, the great breakthrough. Let's face it, in the Cold War, the real technological breakthrough, eventually, was the development of not just high-flying aircraft, the U-2 and the SR-71. The first U-2 flight that went over the Soviet Union collected more intelligence than we had from all agents, all other means of collection. It was just instant. The great breakthrough was the development of the overhead, the geosynchronous satellite. Now we take it for granted. I mean, and a lot of what we photographed, intelligence photographed, is the basis for some of this research into global warming and so forth, because you can now look back for 20, 30, 40 years and actually see, whether it's ice melting or whatever. So, the whole idea, I mean, not everything that's used just comes out of DARPA or out of the military. I think, are you all familiar with In-Q-Tel? Is that, some are, some not be sure. It was In-Q-Tel is essentially sort of a venture capital firm funded by CIA. And the idea is to go out and fund, and I've forgotten how many, they have quite a bit of money and quite a number of contracts out there, but the idea is to fund things. I mean, there's much more going on in the private sector than inside government, with the exception of perhaps DARPA and some other areas. So the idea is to fund some of these things, like the cloak of invisibility. I'm not sure who's funding that, but is to fund these sort of things, so wherever they are, whether it's in government or whether it's coming from without. Yes, you, right there.
I guess going back to the text messaging, I mean, is there a growing reliance on the intelligence agencies to sort of like monitor this sort of communication? Like, I know in Iran it's used as a way to communicate, I mean, at least until it's locked down by the government.
Yeah.
Certain things like it was in a picture, video, audio.
Right.
Of, like demonstrations or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess as far as like the monitoring goes,
I've got your question. In other words, monitoring that sort of thing. Look, you talk about open sources. The intelligence community, principally through FBIS, the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, throughout the Cold War, monitored the newspapers, television, magazines, broadcasts, and so forth of countries, particularly inside the Soviet Union. And the whole idea was that, sure, the media was controlled by the government, it was stifled by the government, but things would slip through. You could see trends going, you could see crime reporting, you could see shortages come up there. So the community, and particularly through that office, always was trying, if you can get something by reading a newspaper, for heaven's sakes, don't run an agent to get it. I mean, it's sloppy, expensive, and it has tremendous blowback potential, right? So we have always been in the business of monitoring. Would intelligence be interested in that sort of thing? Sure it would, because and remember, the more you monitor, it becomes incredibly labor intensive to process all that. As you know, NSA for years has had these problems of, just cartloads of stuff that, have yet been processed. The FBI has had a terrible problem, as you know, with that sort of thing as well, monitoring, because someone has to break it out, translate it, find out what is significant, what isn't significant, make decisions, so forth. All that is terribly labor intensive. Yes.
I forgot what.
Okay. It's all right. I forget things all the time. Okay. Yeah.
Well, we come to these conferences to learn about vulnerabilities, the attacks, so on and so forth, and how we can prevent people from doing it.
Yes.
On the CIA side, since there's that technology is not there, how do you prevent spying and people from internal CIA spying? Okay.
Well, fundamentally, catching people, preventing people or catching people is counterintelligence. Okay. Your national counterintelligence capability is the FBI. Okay. There was always this loose sharing of responsibilities throughout the Cold War. That is, FBI here, CIA often would have a counterintelligence function overseas, concerning American citizens and so forth. Now, your question is, how do we prevent it inside? Well, not perfectly, obviously, because you have Ames and you've had others. There is a counterintelligence center at CIA, and that's its primary function, is both, first of all, there's an Office of Security, sort of fundamental kinds of security things. You have badges and so forth. So you have an Office of Security, administering polygraphs on a regular basis, screening people when they come in, pursuing leads and so forth. Then you have a counterintelligence function dealing with intelligence perhaps collected abroad from double agents and so forth and so on. So it's very, very active. I mean, the intelligence, CIA specifically, had a huge reaction I mean, it's still there. It's still rippling forward to the Ames case. The Ames case was devastating for the community, for us. And the Hansen case was devastating for the Bureau. So they've introduced more regular polygraphing and more compartmentation and stovepiping and so forth. And as you know, the problem with compartmentation and stovepiping is the moment you do that, you're limiting people's ability to work together, so you're taking some of the creativity. I mean, it's a balancing act. It's like civil liberties and national security. So you're always trying to not take away the strength of people working in teams. By the same token, you don't want to do dumb things. So sure, there is a counterintelligence function inside, I think, all the government agencies, some being more active than others. Yes, please. Did you have your hand up? No, you did.
Yeah, during the seminar, we were learning about viruses that are coming from overseas, coming into our businesses and to our...
Piracy, yeah.
Whose jurisdiction does that fall in? Because we were saying there were limitations in which countries we can go into. We know
Okay, your question, and somebody may have a better answer than I do. The question that arises is piracy.
No, viruses.
Oh, I'm sorry?
Viruses.
Piracy. Viruses. I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. That's why I walked near to you so I can hear you. Okay. Viruses. Obviously, and we've had viruses everywhere. We've had them in the private sector, you've had them in the Pentagon, you've had them in all sorts of places. Viruses are clearly a matter of great concern to the government. I mean, it goes to national security, and I'm using that in the broad sense of the word. Obviously, if somebody puts a virus in the Pentagon, that's obviously goes to national security. But, you know, our society, our economy has increasing reliance on the internet. So anyone who is damaging that, who's compromising it, that, I think, in the broad sense, is a national security issue. Now, I think you will probably find the first responder on something like that, my sense would be the FBI. I mean, it certainly wouldn't be local, but if it's a national kind of thing, the virus, I would think certainly FBI. I don't know the extent, which is law enforcement. Homeland Security, I don't know whether they, right now, whether they would extend that far, but certainly FBI is increasingly involved. And as you know, the FBI still, we are now 6 years after 9/11, does not have a central core computer system for, I think, what's called its case file. There's a name for it, and I have forgotten, which I think is just really most unfortunate. I'm CIA, and I'm not going to throw bricks at the FBI. It's a very tough thing, but you just wish somebody, name it Steve Jobs or Gates or somebody would come in and say, we'll do it. Just we'll do it. We don't care what it costs. We'll do it as a national priority. That hasn't happened yet. Okay. Are there anybody? Yeah, you haven't asked any.
I think we'd like to hear what you were going to say about piracy, too.
I thought we were talking, piracy? No, I thought he raised piracy. I would think, well, piracy is stealing, whether it's stealing films or whatever, but it's certainly, it goes to the intellectual property rights issue. Clearly, it's a federal crime if you're violating it, so don't do it. Or be careful. Yes, sir. I was told today, guy drove me down here, I just barely made it, and I was at home in McLean, and the cab wasn't coming, and I looked at him and said, can you take me down to the Westin? And he did. And it was just great. And there was a point here. Oh, I know what it was. As we were driving down GW Parkway, I said I was backed up on GW Parkway. I know some of you don't know where it is. And I said I was so backed up, I had an appointment, I did a U-turn on the median strip. He said, good for you. He's about to get his bar exam, pass his bar exam. He said, that's a federal crime. And you probably also get hit for reckless driving in Virginia. I'm not going to do it again. That's all I needed. Be careful with piracy. Yeah, okay. Yes, back here.
I was wondering, in the computer world, when malicious software penetrates into a computer system, sometimes it causes the other programs to act funny.
Yes.
I was wondering, are there any mental or emotional repercussions for agents that work overseas in the long term?
Okay, the question is that a program, and I assume it could be like a virus, messes up a computer, it causes it to malfunction, in effect.
I mean, because they have to keep their mentality compartmentalized because they have two personas, kind of like schizophrenia, because they have to have this fake life and their actual life. Has that ever caused any mental...
What kind of life? Actual life versus cover life? Yeah, but we're not split personalities. I mean, we try and be good actors in that sense, but it's not quite Jekyll and Hyde. I think the main thing, if you cause some case officer's computer malfunction, he'll just become incredibly frustrated and pound on the table and kick out the sides of his crib.
I think his question was living overseas for a long period of time.
Yeah, living overseas, a person that basically has an act, does that cause mental repercussions or consequences to...
I guess I'm not following the mental consequences, the mental repercussions. We're overseas. When I'm overseas, I'm like I am here. If you met me overseas, this is how I am. If I go into an operation, and that's how I meet people. I mean, I am, who I am. And people like me are sort of go through a screening process, and we're usually considered fairly good with people, that sort of thing. I probably wouldn't have done as well at analysis if I'd gone to that side. If I'm overseas and engage in an operation in another country, yes, I may end up with another passport, another name, different pocket litter, and go into that country. And it depends what I am, what I say I am. Am I some sort of foreign journalist? Am I a writer? Am I a consultant? What I am, my essential personality will be pretty much what it is. I mean, I may have used some of the jargon of whatever cloak I'm putting on, but I'm not getting the mental issue here. You're talking about some mental long-term effect. You mean what is the effect on me?
Yes.
Oh. Yeah. You occasionally find people, look, it's like people go into the military and they go overseas and kill people, right? And they come back and sometimes they have post-traumatic syndrome and so forth. I saw very little of that. I think sometimes people in operations work, by the nature of the job, might become a little more manipulative, say with their wife and their children and their neighbors and so forth. But for the most part, not. I really didn't see that as an issue. We have people who often go under deep cover, and so they're even more exposed. So they might develop a degree of paranoia, but that's good. They should have a degree of paranoia. But I really haven't seen sort of any, yes, have I seen people break down because of the nature of the work? Yes, okay. But it's a breakdown similar to what somebody might have in your profession. Just, the hours are too long, the work's too intense, and the boss doesn't understand. I've got you, and one in the back. No. How about you?
My question has to do with human resource gathering. When 9/11 happened, intelligence agencies and the CIA were pretty heavily criticized because they were still focused on the Cold War Soviet, building up human resources. Since then, it's switched, so now we have agents that are more speaking Pashto, Dari, Farsi, all that good stuff. What's being done to make sure that tomorrow's hot spot, adequate human resources being developed for that?
Okay, good question. Then there was another one up front here. So the question was, we had 9/11. The intelligence community as a whole got criticized. The term was not putting the dots together, and part of it was the Cold War was over. Everybody relaxed. We're a democracy. So what do? We send most of the military home. We close some of our stations overseas. Everybody relaxes. We wait for a peace dividend, right? Yes. And things were happening overseas. We had embassies bombed in Africa. We had the ship Cole bombed. Americans were being killed. And prior to 9/11, George Tenet, then director of CIA, said, "We are at war." in CIA. He put it just that way. And he was running around town, as the media reported, with his hair on fire, warning about what was going on. And there was some reporting that we expected something to happen. We didn't know where, we didn't know when, from Al-Qaeda. And of course what happened was 9/11. There were a couple of dots way out there that if they had been put together in time, might, and I say might, have resulted in us, in the community, getting closer to possibly preventing that. You remember the Moussaoui case? You remember the FBI agent, or actually it was an instructor at a flight school out in, I think, Phoenix, Arizona, and said, hey, I've got a guy in here and all he wants to do is take off and fly. He's not interested in landing. Shouldn't we report that to the FBI? Yeah, I think we ought to report it. Well, let's report it to the FBI. And they did, and it sort of just was one of many things, okay? Even though the reporting in some intelligence reports was that Al-Qaeda might seek to use, aircraft, because they had tried to bomb aircraft, that sort of thing, but not necessarily use one as a weapon. And then you remember in the Moussaoui case, the FBI was not able to gain access to his computer. They didn't have a search warrant for his computer, and FBI headquarters turned it down. And the field even went to CIA and said, can you help us? Can you gin up something? And, they didn't. If we had gotten to Moussaoui early enough, might they have been able to investigate this? So your question is sort of twofold. And I think it's a good one, and that is, okay, so now we're all focused on terrorism. Al-Qaeda, the paramilitary, the covert action aspects, intelligence collection. By the way, it is a very, very tough target. When I worked against the Soviets, East Europeans, and others, I moved in their waters. In other words, I was overseas. I would meet these guys on the dip circuit. I would meet them in the course of business. I was part of the community, if you want. How am I going to meet terrorists? How am I going to gain access to terrorists? The terrorists may be two guys and their first cousin in a cave. And it's not a hierarchy. It's flat. And it's not even connected in many cases. Bin Laden and Zawahiri aren't even in a hierarchical organization in their communications. They are now on to the fact we listen to their cell phones. Some of their communicating is done using medieval methods. They send a messenger. They literally send a messenger with whatever it is they're communicating. Furthermore, what you also have is the phenomenon, because of the nature of Al-Qaeda, you have groups of people in other countries who say, hey, we can be jihadists. I know what we do. Let's kill the American, political attaché. They come up with this on their own. In law enforcement, you call it copycat crime. The problem for intelligence is there's nothing for us to break into to find out what it is they're saying to each other. So the last part of your question, which is a good one, is now that we're all over here looking at terrorism, who's looking at this over here? In other words, the threat we don't know about. And that's a very good question, but the mission of intelligence community is to be aware of threats. In other words, even while we're all looking in that direction, intelligence community is also supposed to be looking over there to see what's happening. So it is a function of intelligence. But I think it's an excellent question. When I took yours, there was somebody right up here. It was you, yes.
Just one question regarding what do you reckon is the best recruitment for it? Historically has been the most successful recruitment tool. Ideology or greed on the other side?
Mm-hmm. What has been the most successful recruitment tool? And I think what you're getting at is what has been driven most people to collaborate covertly with intelligence. In other words, what is their motivation? Somebody once came up with the acronym MICE. Money, ideology, coercion, ego. The thing is, you can take any case and you'll find sometimes elements of all those things. I mean, Rick Ames, who, as I said, have worked for me, I think had something like $2.7 million committed to him. Unfortunately, he's in prison for life without parole. He's not going to get it. And he's not going to get his dacha, which I showed him a picture of on a lake. What was his motivation? If you read Pete Early's book, Confessions of a Spy, which is his interviews with Ames, Ames has a long rationale about the Cold War, and I think the CIA is just spending money, and it's a big, it's just, it's better that we communicate more directly with each other. Now, we know of at least 10 people who were tried and executed as a result of his betrayal. And in Hanson's case, he gave away systems information that's worth billions. So it's even more harm than Ames. Soviets, Russians working against Americans will say one of the main motivation for Americans is money. That's what they say. If you go back to some of the early spies, Soviet spies, Russian spies against us, like the Philby gang and so forth, or even Rosenberg, totally ideological. I don't think the Rosenbergs were ever paid a nickel. I don't think Philby was ever paid a nickel. It was totally ideological. So I have seen both sides of that. Our top agent in Poland, there's a book called A Secret Life, which I did the research for, and Ben Weiser wrote, and we got the information out of CIA. And he provided us with tens of thousands of documents from Polish planning councils. And this was Poland, but the point is, they were at the heart of the Warsaw Pact planning. He was totally ideological. He thought the administration in Warsaw had betrayed the Polish people, that if there were war between the Soviets and the Americans, Poland would be destroyed. And he acted purely, he was what we call a walk-in or a volunteer, and he acted purely out of ideological motives. Ames, I mentioned the price tag, but Ames, like Hansen, I think had this feeling that he had never been fully recognized for how good he was. So I don't think there's any, in my mind, there's no question that in both Ames and Hansen's case, ego played a role. So you have there, I don't think ideology did, but I think both money, and Hansen was paid in gold and diamonds as well, but nothing on the scale of Ames. So everybody, I think my message to you is, part of what recruitment is about is determining what does motivate people, and what their goals are, what they want to do. And some people are motivated by revenge. They are so bitter about how they've been treated in their organization that they want to get back at it. And I know there's no one in this room that has that in them, okay? But we do run across that. And there's an element of that, I think in both Ames and Hansen, yes?
A follow-up question. If you go into another country to bribe someone to give you information, that person will be under some scrutiny to begin with because he has access to that information. What does he do with the money? He can't spend it. Okay.
Now, your statement was, when I go overseas and bribe someone, I wish you wouldn't use that term. Okay. You said when I go overseas and bribe someone. You didn't need to say that. Yeah, okay. The issue is, and it's a very good question, if we are paying someone money, and you can call it whatever you want, if we are paying someone money, and that person spends it or lives beyond their means, isn't that a giveaway? And the answer to you is absolutely. And that's why people were always upset about the agency not getting onto Ames earlier, because he was living beyond his means. But typically, agencies, there's a limit to how much they're looking into what their employees are doing, how much they're spending. I mean, he drove a Jaguar, okay? And so the media grabbed a hold of that and said, oh, guilt by car type. He drove a Jaguar. Well, a lot of our people live overseas. They make good money. And in some cases, they save a lot of money. Their housing is provided and so forth. A lot of our people like sports cars, and they'll buy them there and bring them back. When the FBI, I think it was the FBI, said, let's go out, they were going to bug his Jaguar. So they sent someone out to the parking lot to find it. They couldn't find it because there were too many Jaguars. Okay? The other thing the media never kept in mind is that Ames, being smart, did not just put cash down for his Jaguar. He did what everybody else did. He bought it through the credit union. Okay? What's suspicious about that? Everybody in this country drives more car than they can afford. So, but it's an accrual of things that leads you to finally say, hey, this guy's living beyond his means or gal or whatever. And maybe it's an inheritance. I mean, there are people that probably colleagues you have that seem to do better than you do. Yeah, might make you suspicious. On the other hand, you know, they hit it rich, they had an inheritance, they sold a house and made more than you did, whatever it is. But it is something, it is a giveaway. And that's why, for example, when we run agents, we constantly counsel about, you know, living beyond their means. It was a quick hand right here, yes. Am I missing it? I'll walk over there. Yes, go ahead.
I had a question about like, sort of like current propaganda operations going on, or the lack thereof. Because I mean, I know during the Cold War we had a lot of,
yes,
you know, counter
yes,
propaganda.
yes.
Worked really, really well, and just kind of wondering why we don't have.
Well, you remember Karen Hughes came in the State Department and went on a listening tour. The U.S. is not doing very well with its overt voice. And to the extent there's a covert voice, you and I aren't going to know about it. And my hope is, because what we're engaged in is very much about hearts and minds. My hope is that we are doing things covertly as well. Yes. But you won't know about it.
Right, but I mean, my point was that during the Cold War, there was that sense where there was, I mean, it was so loud that it didn't hear your voice, whereas now it's like, we just seem to be getting our asses handed to us.
We are, and a lot of that, you know, covert action will not save you if your overt policy is terrible. I'm not going to comment on the administration or anything, but covert action can only do so much. It can go in and help leverage things. Yes, please.
In terms of globalization, and clearly technology has kind of sped that up, and you talked about some of the inter-agency disconnects and
Sure.
intra-agency disconnects. So how do you see the covert or clandestine operations playing a key role in the fight against cyber warfare?
Playing a key role in what?
Cyber warfare.
Oh, cyber warfare. How do I see clandestine operations playing a key role in cyber warfare?
But I'm thinking in terms of, you know, there are the international laws that kind of oversee that and what we have a right to do and what constitutes.
Okay. Now remember, and this is a good question, and I think, tell me if I've got it right. The question was referring at one point to sort of the turf battles and things, but that's government. I mean, there's nothing sinister about it, and it's amazing we get some things done. What can I say about the ability of the clandestine service, primarily in the CIA, to assist with in the cyber warfare? Right? Okay. I think, and I'm not sure what CIA's specifically cyber capabilities, you know, in that arena are. However, remember the clandestine service is designed in some cases to go around those laws. In other words, to go after people who are doing something that we've identified. So I think to that extent, we have an ability which goes beyond, say, what the Justice Department can do or the Federal Bureau of Investigation can do from its overt side. We are the covert side. So I would like to think we can help. Yes, right back here.
How dangerous is it for agents that you run? What's the percentage of the agents run get caught by the...
How dangerous for...
How dangerous the agents?
Yeah. The question is how dangerous for CIA officers like myself. During the Cold War... I'm sorry, I'm not hearing it.
The agents that you recruit.
Yes. Okay. During the Cold War, there was sort of an unwritten, I mean, we were not trying to assassinate, despite Hollywood's approach, KGB officers. Embarrass them, recruit them, do all kinds of things, but we weren't deliberately targeting them for assassination, nor were they us. So, you know, people died sometimes because there were proxy wars going on. The friends that I have that died as a result of terrorist action, actually. So there were paramilitary type situations during the Cold War, like Vietnam. That's military. So, and you had intelligence operations going on all through that period. So your question is, how dangerous is it for us and for our agents? You know, it's totally situational. It depends where you are. For example, law enforcement officers, FBI, typically carry a weapon. They're required to carry a weapon, okay? Intelligence officers typically do not. I was never armed. There was only one occasion I was authorized to carry a weapon. I was trained in weapons, but I typically never had to carry one. That wasn't our mode of operation. Now, with these situations that we're dealing with, people being stationed in countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan, Iraq, and so forth, more of our people are not only getting weapons training and defensive driving training, but they are carrying weapons abroad. You asked about the threat to our agents. Being exposed as an American agent in a country depends entirely on what's going on in that country. In some countries, you know, you could lose your job, lose your reputation. In other countries, you might be tried. In some countries, you might be killed. So certainly there is a risk, and that's why, to the extent possible, we commit ourselves to protect our sources, to get them out of the country in the event. The case I mentioned to you, A Secret Life, about the Polish Colonel Kuklinski, in his case, he worked for us for almost 10 years, and at the very end, he felt that someone had exposed him, that they were closing in. We smuggled him out black, as we say. That is, we literally smuggled him out of the country along with his wife, 2 sons, and one of the son's fiancée. We went back for the fiancée, as a matter of fact. But we feel that if we will not commit to that we cannot protect our sources, then you can't ask somebody to take that risk and then abandon them. That would, yes, sir.
During the Cold War, if CIA officer was acting covertly with the Soviets and the Soviets would find out, what would they typically do? Would they just kick that person out of the country, or would they?
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends. A lot of our people were officials, therefore there was a diplomatic cover, and so they'd be declared persona non grata, meaning you're not wanted here anymore. You got a day to get out of town. In some cases, if someone was engaged in espionage and they're not an American official, you know, they go into the slammer, and then we'll see what we can do. We go from there. Yeah, go from there. We may or may not have to expose them. Yeah, I want to make sure. You haven't asked a question. Yes, I don't think you have, unless you're in disguise. All right.
In Italy, there was a judge who issued an arrest warrant for a number of CIA officers.
Yes.
The question I have is about the trade craft, because I
Yes.
read in the news that they were using their frequent flyer numbers to travel.
Yes, yes. You're asking about the Italian case, and that was when we grabbed someone off the street in Italy. This is this hot pursuit thing I talked about earlier. And it looked like the trade craft was very poor. And they've got arrest warrants out now for these people. What I don't know is the extent to which the government was witting means knowing of what we were doing, and therefore there wasn't this feeling of extra care and tradecraft and so forth. If the government was not witting and we were doing it, as we say, unilaterally, then it was an abomination. That's referred to today in the New York Times piece on Jose Rodriguez, the one accused of burning the tapes or ordering the destruction of the tapes. Because that case came up, and I think the then director, who was Porter Goss, directed that there be an investigation of the DO for that, and Jose Rodriguez said, no, we'll investigate ourselves. Well, if you have a strong director, you don't say to the director, no, we'll do it ourselves, okay? I think that speaks to the nature of that director rather than to Jose Rodriguez. How are we doing on time, Jeff?
Probably another 10 minutes or so.
Okay, you know, if there are more questions, if they're, you know, if we've exhausted your interest, and so I'll come right back to you. Yes. I'm sorry, I thought you had your hand up. Oh, it was you.
Yeah, I guess on war story side, of course, you covered Eastern Europe and then Russia in general.
Yes.
Any interesting stories on entry and bugging and particular techniques, maybe? I deal a lot with physical security, lockpicking, and bypassing.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Okay.
I run a few stuff around, and we'll talk later about it. But,
You can just leave your card on the podium up there when we're through. Okay.
I have a lot of friends that, also in Germany currently, they have friends that work Stasi that after years said, like, I have these tools that I use, and I've seen them and like, wow, they're completely offensive in the sense of like they're for attack, not for like locksmith purposes.
Yeah. Have you seen Lives of Others yet?
I was going to just ask, have you seen it?
Oh, I've seen it. Yes, yeah. If you haven't seen it, it's an excellent film. It's about life in East Germany with this. The Stasi actually had recruited, if you want, or coerced, whatever word you want to use, 1/4 of the population to spy on the rest of the population. After the Cold War, the Stasi files were captured, initially by CIA. Eventually, I think they went back to the Germans, and now Germans can go in and research what their Stasi file was, and it has led to a number of divorces and so forth. There was a very, very prominent woman dissident in East Germany whose life was at stake sometimes, but she was sort of the voice of dissidents, and her strongest supporter was her husband. And after the Cold War, and they went into the files, he was a Stasi agent. So she did divorce him. But there were a number of cases where husbands and wives, one was spying on the other. So it's very sad, because it really was a police state. If you have not seen it, Lives of Others, and if you do see it, the great role in that film is by the Stasi officer who is working against this couple and then becomes impacted by their idealism, and he himself works towards their good. He died shortly after the film was complete, and I think it won some awards in yeah. So, but I highly recommend it. You were asking about break-ins. Well, one story, I remember going into the basement of a foreign, he was a colonel in their military intelligence, and typically the role of a case officer is because we know the country. We often have the language, we sort of know stuff. If we have to, the station's in touch with the local authorities and so forth. So there are a number of pressure points we can push. So I had a team of people like you who were better, you know, I had some basic lockpicking, but these guys were good. And so I had, I think, 3 of them, as a matter of fact. So this fellow was away. He was due back shortly, with a day later than when we went in. And we were down in the basement. We really had bugs all over the place. And we broke a pipe. And there we were, you know, up to what? It was terrible. And these guys, I thought they were going to lynch me. I mean, you know, you said this would be you, and they're shoveling away. We're trying to get the water out and cover it up and so forth. We did it. But that was one of the worst break-ins, the float-ins, I could probably say. And there was, yes?
Maybe you can comment on some of the stuff they just released from the Kennedy assassination. Have you been following that? They had the... We're
all following the Kennedy assassination. You can make a living lecturing on the Lincoln, on the Lincoln assassination or the Kennedy assassination.
I know, but I mean, there was
some
stuff released.
I saw the article. I saw they released some stuff. Nothing. Certainly, there are people who do this for a living. Okay, there was nothing in what was released. Are you all aware of this? They recently, in the safe, in the Attorney General's office in Dallas, there was a safe containing some of the material evidence from the Kennedy assassination. The knuckles, the brass knuckles Ruby was carrying, and the pistol, a transcript that claims to be a conversation between Ruby and Oswald and so forth. It had been sealed in there since the trial, and the new Attorney General said, listen, we're a transparent administration. We're not going to sit on this stuff, open it up. So they've opened it up. There was nothing there that quickly caught, I thought, oh my goodness, now we know X, Y, Z. Yeah. But mark my words, there'll be a whole new spate of books on this, okay? You can make a living doing this. Yes, sir.
How would you rate all, in general, foreign intelligence services as far as quality, and where would Iran fit in?
Okay. The question is, where would I rate foreign intelligence services, and specifically, where would Iran fit in there? Let me just make one comment, and I'll try to answer your question. That is that many intelligence services around the world, one of their strengths is they're only covering a limited part of the world. Okay. Even Israel, which has had a legendary intelligence service, is really covering the middle. They're really concerned about their neighborhood. Let me put it that way. That's their primary focus, which doesn't mean they're not going to be interested in some situation. Remember, there was a Jewish, an Israeli, was it the embassy? No, it was a community center bombed in where was it? Was it Brazil? Yeah. So other than those kinds of things, many services have the luxury of focusing on one thing. East Germany, which had a legendary intelligence service, their focus was 95% on West Germany. That was their focus, and they were terrific at it. As you know, they got someone close to Willy Brandt, the president, and there's a play been written about this called Democracy. So you can take some of the services. One of the issues for American intelligence is we were required to cover the world. And as Tenet testified on the Hill shortly before he retired, he had fewer CIA officers around the world than there are policemen in New York City. In other words, we really are a small number of people. And so it's sort of an elite force. But, to take on the world, and we had stations in many countries, we were covering a lot of issues, and now you've got, the emergence of China and India and the globalization. Everything became globalized. You mentioned the word globalization. Crime became globalized. Terrorism became globalized. Drug smuggling became, and often these are interlaced. And so the very nature of globalization poses, a horrendous problem for someone trying to collect intelligence. But certainly, the Israelis were good. These Germans were good. The Cubans were good. Cubans trained by these Germans. Again, tiny island. Who are they covering? The U.S. Uncle Sam. Okay. And Iran. You raised Iran specifically. Iran, of course, within Iran. Has a very Savak, of course, was the Shah's service. They were sort of all pervasive, except they didn't foresee what was happening within their own country. Just as the KGB did not, in the end, see that the Soviet Union was going to dissolve. So they were pretty good. I have no reason to believe they're not just as good. And the Iranians will also carry out foreign operations. We had several years ago an assassination in Bethesda, the little, mild neighborhood of Bethesda, of an Iranian dissident. And as I recall, I think the assassin was disguised as a postman or a delivery person or something, but he literally shot the individual, escaped, and I don't think he was ever caught. But we have seen Iranians going after dissidents, which is something that Stalin started. The idea, let's face it, when they overthrew the Tsar at the time of the Russian Revolution, they were dissidents. So they know that people outside the country, throwing bricks and so forth and so on, can pose a real threat. And so and some of these countries will go after dissidents, and Iran was one of them. So I think they have a relatively formidable internal security service, and they're prepared to do external operations. And, there's no question that they're mucking around in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they're right there. It's easy for them. It's such a porous border. So what does it do? It causes us to bleed more. That's fine. That's in their interest. Yes, sir.
On the topic of the spy museum, is the spy museum doing any planning for any cyber spying
Does the Spy Museum have anything on cyber spying? I think probably not. I've got to redo one of the rooms, which is the last room. And that might be a very useful thing to address because, you know, cyber espionage, cyber spying, that's the signature movement of our times, the internet and so forth. So thank you. Good suggestion. Yes, sir.
What shall I say, the tenure of what Russia is doing now.
Yes.
I think is a little bit ominous. Could you sort of talk about 1990 through today and maybe the future of the Russian/Soviet spy?
Okay. Russia in our last minute and a half or whatever it is we've got. What we have seen is that ever since Peter the Great, the Russians have been very interested in foreign technology. And they've been very good at stealing it. We saw that right through the proximity fuse missile that brought down the U-2 was a device that Rosenberg gave to his case officer Feklisov in New York one Christmas. The Russians have a terrific track record of stealing technology, which obviously accelerates their development of technology. We have seen no let up on that. That is, and I think Trechikov, the fellow that I referred to, Comrade J, confirmed that they are as active now, if not more so, than during the Cold War. And now, of course, they've got oil money. They are working from unlimited resources, and they are a country that's trying to catch up. Many parts of Russia are ahead of the archives now. There's a wonderful book about the Soviet inroads into America on the eve of World War II. Terrific book. But the archives closed. There was a brief window that was open. But certainly, as the 90s went through, I mean, Russia was bankrupt. It went from being a bankrupt country on the ropes. KGB went through a real period of reform, but I think they're back, they're strong, and very active on behalf of the country. Sorry?
Take one more question.
Sure. Here's one. Let me take his.
What stories could you relate about covert operations, which were more or less overt, kind of a...
Well, I think when you talk about, I'm not sure what you mean when you say covert operations that were more or less overt. Well, obviously our support to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which led to the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan and was the Soviets' Vietnam, and led eventually to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that was covert support by CIA. And frankly, in the beginning, we didn't foresee that we could actually drive the Soviets out. We were trying to bleed the Soviets. And this is the whole basis of the film Charlie Wilson's War. If any of you either read the book or seen the movie, was Charlie Wilson with a CIA guy named Gustav Rakotos, who was a friend of mine, really escalated that, and they got Stinger missiles, and eventually the Soviets ran out. That was a covert operation, but gradually it became overt. Now, why did it become overt? Part of it, this gets very political, was an administration wants to show that it's doing things and so forth, so information leaks out. Usually the ship of state leaks from the top, okay? It's not you guys, it's from the top. So that is an example of what was essentially a covert action. I went out there with the Inspector General in the early days to see what we were doing. We literally were putting stuff in car trunks and giving it to the Muj. So eventually it got much more elaborate than that, much fancier than that. And but read Ghost Wars by Steve Cole about our activities in Afghanistan. But Charlie Wilson's War is good too. Okay, listen, it's been great talking to you all. I in a sense envy your work. You're you are at the ground floor of all of this. You've got years ahead of you. So I wish you well. I know a lot of what you're doing is on behalf of our country because of the folks that you're working with. So Godspeed to you. Good luck. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.